problems are there with soil that is making you write books about it?
You know, I'm a geologist, so thinking about writing books about soil is probably not the first thing on my agenda out of grad school. But if you look at the state of the world's soils today and how they've been treated through history, we've degraded something like a third of the world's farmland to the point that it's actually out of production. And you can go back to some Roman tax records, for example. There's areas of Syria and Libya that used to be very rich agriculturally, where it's hard to grow anything today because the soil simply isn't there anymore. So there's really two big problems in terms of soil degradation that someone like me would be very concerned about. One is the loss of the soil itself off the landscape, soil erosion. Because if you take a landscape that had healthy, fertile soil and you strip it down to bedrock, you're not going to farm it very well. You're not going to support a lot of people off it. But the other problem is the degradation of soil. Taking soil that was rich in organic matter, was rich in biology, rich in life, very fertile, with high tilth. If you take that and you degrade it, turn it into more like California beach sand, so you're missing the organic matter, it's not as fertile. And it's that degradation problem is another big problem that modern conventional agriculture has accelerated. So I've been concerned about both problems for a while now, and that's why Ann and I would have written sort of 3 books about soil. The first one, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, looks backwards through history at the destruction of soils around the world and their degradation, really since the dawn of agriculture. And it was a difficult book to finish writing because it kind of had a depressing view if you look back through history. But I started to turn that depression into optimism when we bought a house in North Seattle, and my biologist, gardener wife, Ann, restored the fertility of our land, restored our soil. And our understanding of that led to the second book, how microbes were the essential ingredient for rebuilding healthy, fertile soil. And the third book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, was the one that looked at how do you apply those examples from the hidden half of nature that Ann and I wrote together to the problem of how do you restore soils on farmland around the world. And that process, that evolution of my own thinking, turned me very much into an optimist that rebuilding healthy, fertile soils can be good not only for farmers and make them more profitable by using fewer agrochemicals, but it can also improve the quality of the food that we eat. And it can help with other environmental problems. So I've gone on this full journey from being a full-on pessimist about soils at a global scale to being very much an optimist today.
What is a quick summary of your book, Growing a Revolution?
Well, in Growing a Revolution, I traveled around the world to visit farmers who had already restored fertility to their land. Because, as a geologist, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, how should you farm on a particular piece of land? Farming is an amazingly complex applied ecological problem. So I took the tact, instead of going and trying to tell farmers about how to farm, I went to farmers who'd already turned relatively degraded farms into really thriving, productive, profitable farms. And I said, what'd you do? How'd you do it? Give me a shovel, let's dig holes in your soils, and let's go to your neighbor's field, dig holes in their soils, and see the difference. And Growing a Revolution is really the story of both the backstory of soil degradation through the course of previous civilizations, but it focuses much more on solutions, how farmers today are around the world, in Costa Rica, in equatorial Africa, across the U.S. from the Dakotas to Pennsylvania, how they've all embraced a new style of agriculture, a different way of thinking about how they treat the soil. And that's the real key, how one thinks about what we take for granted, the earth beneath our feet, and how they've used that to their advantage to adopt practices that build the fertility of their land and thereby allow them to keep producing large amounts of food in a very intensive agronomic settings, but also improve the land as they do it. And that turning around from having agriculture degrade the fertility of the soil, which is a big focus of the Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations book, and have farming become an agent of positive change, of building fertility, of improving the environment while improving the on-farm economics as well. To me, that was the big transition, and that's what we write about in Growing a Revolution.
What role does soil play in keeping the planet healthy?
Boy, Earth is the only planet we know of that has soil. And so, well, what is soil? It's the interface between sort of the rocky interior of the Earth, the world of geology, and the bustling world of life that is really like a thin crust on the outside, the wrapper for Earth, if you will. And soil is the interface between those worlds. And it's the place where the processes that happen in the soil, through both the action of plants and the life in the soil, help get mineral elements out of the rocks and into plants, where they can then enter the biological world. Because if we look at the gross chemistry of biology, it's carbon-based, carbon-based life forms. When we think about science fiction movies, we're always looking for those in other places. Carbon is really sort of the backbone of life as we know it. But we also need nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and plants get the carbon that they build their bodies from out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, combining carbon dioxide with water to build the carbohydrates and the other molecules that they build their bodies out of. They get nitrogen often in partnership with microbes that live around their roots, nitrogen-fixing bacteria as they're called. But those are only 4 of the elements that we need to build life. There's all kinds of other things: iron, zinc, copper, manganese. There's a whole list of micronutrients, things that we need in great part because they structure proteins, and they help give functionality to organic molecules. And we get those all ultimately come out of rocks. And if you've ever done the experiment of taking a rock and just setting it out in the sidewalk somewhere and wanting to see how long it'll take to break down into soil, your great-grandkids are going to be continuing that experiment for you. Nature builds soils very slowly, but they're critical to the cycles and processes that really drive the great wheel of life, in the sense that how do dead things in a forest or a grassland, a natural ecosystem, get reworked into new life? It's through the breakdown of those once living things and the action of bacteria and fungi in the soil that repurpose and reprocess that material into compounds that can be taken up by new generations of plants. And if nothing that died ever broke down in the soil, if it was never decayed, we'd be buried under once living organisms. Earth's been around a long time, there's been a lot of life on it. And if we stopped getting new elements out of the rocks, we'd have problems as well. But if you look at the general chemistry of a plant, or a person, they're totally different than a rock. And you can think of a soil as essentially a refining machine, that through generations, through cycles of life and death, the life in the soil help pull those micronutrients we need out of the rocks, where they're present and usually in pretty low concentrations. They get them into the world of life, and then it recycles through life and death and life and death and life and death over again. And it's that cycling that makes soils so important for terrestrial life, for the life on the continents, life out of the oceans. Because without that, we'd be hard-pressed to get all those elements we need out of the rocks in a short order. We rely on the concentration in plants and animals to provide what we need to power our bodies.
What kinds of minerals are in the soil, and why is that important?
Yet when you look at what it takes for us to be healthy, we tend to think of calories as the fuel that powers our bodies, but we also need mineral elements that ultimately came out of rocks, that's when they're called minerals, that help serve functions, help structure proteins. If you look at sort of a carbohydrate molecule, or sort of the basic carbon-based backbone of life, sort of a simple or complex sugar, if you start adding metals into that structure, it starts to fold it. You can start actually build proteins, and it's their three-dimensional geometry that actually gives them functionality in biological systems. And it's these mineral elements that we don't need very much of, but we sure need them to drive the processes in our body that help us support health. A lot of these sort of very specialized molecules depend on mineral elements of one sort or another. And there's a whole list of mineral micronutrients. And there's major elements that we need as well, things like potassium and phosphorus that ultimately came out of rocks. Potassium is really common in the bulk chemistry of rocks. Phosphorus is a lot rarer, but both are high-graded and brought into biological circulation by the processes in the soil. But it's a lot of those mineral micronutrients, copper, zinc, selenium, things that we need in little amounts that if you get too much can actually be toxic, but that we really need enough of to basically allow our bodies to build the compounds that help give them our functionality, that help drive our immune system, help drive our resistance to disease, for example. So if we don't get enough of the mineral micronutrients out of the rocks and into our crops and into our livestock and thereby into us when we eat them, there's a different kind of malnutrition. It's called hidden hunger, which is when you get enough calories, but you're not getting enough of the mineral micronutrients that your body needs to be healthy. Because it takes different elements for us to grow than to be healthy. They complement each other. I mean, we obviously need enough calories. Starving to death is a horrible way to go. And there's this other style of malnutrition, though, where you have enough calories, but you're not getting enough mineral micronutrients. And that's the kind of malnutrition that tends to affect the developed world.
What happens if a farmer's soil is deficient in minerals or other nutrients that crops need?
Yeah, so you can look at the soil in a farmer's field in relation to the abundance of minerals in two ways. The first way is just, are those minerals there in the first place? And there's certain soils developed on certain rocks around the world that are deficient in certain minerals. Like say you're farming on a limestone geology. It's a calcium carbonate rock. So there's a lot of calcium and a lot of carbonate in the rock, so there's not going to be a deficiency of calcium in the soil. But there may be deficiencies in other elements that don't tend to be in limestone. And there's certain rock types around the world where you can just map the geology based on the plants growing on them because of the deficiencies in mineral elements. You can go to, say, California, and there's the serpentinite terrain there. It's a kind of rock that has a different mineralogy than most other rocks, and you have a completely different suite of plants growing on it. So first question is, in terms of minerals in the soil and whether they're deficient or not, is what's the geology under your farm? Because you might need to actually add something, or it may take more to get the micronutrients out because they're not there in much abundance. But if you actually look at most farmland soils around most of the world, there's enough of most mineral elements in the rock particles, in the soil particles, to actually grow healthy crops and support healthy livestock and healthy people. But getting them out of the rock particles is not a simple matter, and that's where soil life comes in, where the biology comes in. The bacteria and fungus that live in the soil, a lot of them, some of them specialize in getting particular kinds of elements out of the mineral particles in the soil or straight from the bedrock. And that's things like phosphorus, for example. There's an awful lot of phosphorus in the world's farmlands now that's been added over the last 100 years through fertilizer application that's tied up in an insoluble form of phosphorus, so it's not available to a plant. If you think about the roots of a plant as a straw that can draw up water from the soil, whatever's in that water can help nourish the plant. But nothing in the soil that's insoluble, that's not going to be dissolving in that water, is going to be in the water to help nourish the plant. And plants themselves will exude acids out of their roots, and the fungus in the soil can exude acids, and the bacteria and the fungus can work together to actually get particular mineral elements, micronutrients, out of soil particles, and they will actually bring them and trade them to plants for sugars that the plants exude out of their roots to feed microbes in the soil. So there's sort of two ways to look at a mineral deficiency in the soil. The first one is an absolute deficiency. You've got the wrong rock type for that kind of mineral, and if you only eat food off of the farms, off of those rock types, without some kind of mineral supplementation, you'll be short on something. The other way to look at it is it's there in the soil, but it's not getting into the plants, because our agronomic practices can actually dismantle the fungal mines that are actually getting that material out of the rock particles and disrupt the subterranean interstate system where the microbial truckers are bringing that mined material back and trading it to the plants. And there's many of our practices in modern conventional agriculture disrupt those systems.
What practices are nullifying that process?
Modern practices that disrupt life in the soil include everything from tillage, from plowing, which was a big subject of the first book in the Dirt trilogy that Ann and I wrote, the Dirt book. But they also include the over-application of nitrogen fertilizers, because that can actually stimulate a lot of short-term bacterial explosion in the soil, because you're feeding it nitrogen, a nutrient. But if the bacteria then consume a whole lot of soil organic matter, as a result of that, you kind of draw down the batteries of the soil. So you get a short-term boost of fertility, but you degrade it over the long run. And if we look at the organic matter content of, say, farmland soils across North America today, they're roughly half of what they were at the time of European colonization, through a fuzzy averaging over the continent. And you can think we've basically drawn down the native fertility of our soil by about 50% in that sense. And that's one of the reasons why we're so dependent on modern agrochemical agriculture, is that you can grow big plants and high yields in a very degraded soil if you add the major elements that plants need for growth. But what are they then missing? they'll be missing some of those mineral micronutrients. They'll be missing the beneficial metabolites that microorganisms make from the sugars that plants push out into the soil to recruit and feed them. And so there could be an impact on crop health. So the state of the soil and how it is affected by our farming practices is actually a big concern, because one of the things about being a geologist is that I tend to think of time in pretty large chunks. And if you think about how we would sustain farming over the course of a civilization, you're not talking about maintaining yields for this year or a decade or even a century. You're talking about doing it for centuries, if not millennia. And we've had big problems with that in the past.
What can we do to make our soil healthier?
Yes, there's a growing interest in soil health among farmers, among agronomists. It's really kind of a movement that in many respects is being led by farmers in different parts of the world. And what is soil health? It's the ability of the soil to keep producing crops over the long run without being degraded. And it tracks into the abundance of life in the soil and the character of that life in that soil. Is it beneficial to the crops, or is it pests and pathogens? A healthy, fertile soil is more of the former and less of the latter. And what are the practices that one can do to build healthy, fertile soil? It really boils down to things that cultivate the beneficial life in the soil. Because most soil life is either, doesn't help crops or is beneficial to them. It's very specific organisms that tend to be the pests and pathogens. But it's diverse communities of organisms that are producing metabolites and getting mineral elements out of the soil and interacting with the plants in what Ann and I called the biological bazaar. It's a great the original underground economy where plants are pushing out food, sugars, proteins, fats into the soil to attract and recruit particular kinds of microbes that make things out of that food, their metabolites, their waste products, that actually help the health and growth of the plants. And sort of cultivating those kind of interactions and relationships are the way to really build healthy, fertile soil as a consequence of agriculture. And one of the things I learned in interviewing farmers around the world for Growing a Revolution was that it really boils down to almost three principles, which is minimize disturbance of the soil, which equates to things like no-till farming, farming without the plow, planting seeds directly into the ground without turning the ground over. And there's technologies now to do that. The second piece of the stool that holds up to scrutiny is growing cover crops, keeping the ground covered with a living plant, something where there's a root alive in the soil, but also the ground is covered by leafy matter through the course of the year. So if you're a cash crop farmer, in between one's cash crops, plant cover crops. What cover crops also do is if you basically kill them and let them rot back on the fields, they're a source of carbon that then decays and feeds the soil life. They're also a source of action that's getting mineral elements out of the soil. And the third element is growing a diversity of crops.
You propose 3 things for the soil that will improve and maintain its fertility. What are they, and why are they so important to growing crops?
In visiting farmers around the world for writing Growing a Revolution, I found that the ones who'd been very successful at restoring fertility to their land had 3 common principles that governed the practices they used on their farms. And it was minimizing disturbance of the soil, keeping the ground covered with a cover crop, and growing a diversity of crops. And what those 3 things are and why they work so well to rebuild the fertility of land is that's a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. And if you look at those 3 principles, they're 180 degrees from what we've spent the last 100 years teaching people in terms of modern farming, where we've taught them to plow a lot, to use a lot of agrochemicals, and to grow 1 or 2 crops. What we're talking about here is a different philosophy that underpins how you think about the land, how you think about the soil, how you treat the land as the foundation for developing farming practices that could apply in both conventional and in organic systems. It's sort of a very different debate and argument. Thinking about soil health translates across cropping systems, and it extends into agroforestry, into viticulture. The idea of trying to cultivate the beneficial life in the soil as a way to promote the health and growth of plants really cuts across the board.
If we stop plowing, how are we going to farm?
It's a great question. It's one of the ones I wrestled with in writing the Dirt book and again in Growing a Revolution. And we have ways now of doing no-till farming where instead of having a plow that inverts the soil, literally turns the soil upside down, and they cut like a narrow little furrow or a narrow little trench about the width of my little finger, and you can plant seeds directly down into it. And there's companies that build these as commercial planters. John Deere, for example, would be happy to sell you one. And you can walk behind one after they've planted, and it's hard to tell that the ground is disturbed because you're planting through the remains of the previous crop. And so you can knock down the crop stubble from the prior crop, cut this little trench, plant right into it, and because your seeds are there first, they're the ones that come up first. They have advantage over any weeds that could come in. And there's other methods of weed control that people use that I talk about in Growing a Revolution. And you often hear about no-till farming that it takes a lot of herbicides to practice that. And so I went and interviewed farmers who have figured out clever ways to not use a lot of herbicides, whether they're juggling the timing of when they plant. Some guys are planting into the corn before they harvest it, so when they harvest the corn, their cover crop is already up and ahead of the weeds, and then they kill the cover crop and plant the corn back through it. And they can kill the cover crop with sort of like a big steamroller drum known as a crop roller. Some guys are bringing cattle in to graze off their cover crops, which I view as an accelerant on rebuilding soil because the cows will eat the crop residue and turn it into manure that gets back spread across the field and can be taken back. The elements in it can be taken back up by the plants because they're more soluble than a corn stalk. So there's clever ways people have been thinking about how to do this, but you'll notice that 2 out of those 3 principles, cover cropping and crop rotations, they're not new ideas. They're really ancient ideas. Traditional societies around the world practiced that. We were planting legumes into our crop rotations in various parts of the world for centuries, if not millennia, before we even knew what nitrogen was. And one of the benefits of legumes is that they partner with nitrogen-fixing bacteria and sort of get natural fertilizer into the soil. But people had, through experiences, figured out things that worked. What's new about this new style of farming is combining that ancient wisdom with the modern technology that allows us to do things like no-till farming. Getting those 3 pieces together, I think, could be transformative to agriculture.
What are cover crops and what do they do for soil?
Yeah, so a cover crop is a crop that you plant and grow, not so much for harvest, but to benefit the soil, to keep the ground covered so it's not going to erode. And they also extract mineral elements from the soil to build their bodies. And so when you grow a cover crop and you then kill the cover crop and you let it rot on your fields, you're using that cover crop to essentially generate natural fertilizer, where it's pulling elements through its bacterial and fungal partners in the soil out into its body. It takes it from the subsoil, for example, gets it above ground. When the plant dies and rots at the surface, those elements are released back into the topsoil, and the roots of your next cash crop can take them back up as essentially fertilizer. So cover crops really sort of serve a couple purposes. One is to help keep the soil on the land so it doesn't erode, because it's bare earth that really erodes faster than anything. But they also help with nutrient cycling. And so you can view cover crops as kind of an investment in building soil quality that over time can generate a good return, both in terms of improved soil quality, but it also allows farmers to help offset and reduce some of their nitrogen fertilizer. And if you build soil health up enough, it can really help offset the need for pesticides. And so a lot of farmers have found that by adopting this combination of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and a diversity of plants, which helps get a diversity of microbes in the soil that provides a diversity of metabolites to help with crop health, that they're able to greatly reduce their fertilizer and pesticide and diesel use. What are the 3 biggest expenditures in modern conventional farming? It's those 3, fertilizer, diesel, and pesticides. And so if farmers can grow comparable yields, spending less on their inputs, they can do better economically. And I started teasing some of the farmers I was visiting who had adopted these practices, some of the early adopters who've been very successful at it and really improved their soil. I started calling them organic-ish farmers because they were conventional farmers. They had no interest in being organic farmers, just based on their own personal situation. but they were hardly using any agrochemicals anymore. One of them is now completely off of synthetic nitrogen and pesticides. He's basically an organic farmer, but he didn't do it to be an organic farmer. He did it because that's the way you build the health and fertility of your land. Yeah, if you leave a field sort of bare, a bare fallow, just a bare earth field, what happens when it rains and there's no plants covering the soil up? We've all seen like construction sites in the urban environment. After good rainfall, the water running off of it is brown, right? It's full of soil that had been on that site. Well, farm fields are not that different. If you leave them bare, if there's nothing to protect the soil when you get a rain or a good windstorm, if you're in a windy area, that soil can leave. It can erode, and it can erode much faster than it was forming because nature takes centuries to form an inch of soil. You can lose an inch of soil in decades off of bare plowed fields. Those numbers are out by a factor of at least 10, and that's been one of the big backstories of civilization after civilization, where you don't notice the degradation of your soil year to year. Where you notice it is over the course of your lifetime. And the first times I went actually to farming communities around the American Midwest and was talking with people about long-term agricultural deterioration of the soil, I was a little worried about how I'd be received, right? So dropping into a farming community and talking about how the plow had taken down civilizations in the past. But I had older gentlemen stand up after some of my talks and basically said, I've seen what you're talking about on my farm. We have to change the way we farm so that our grandchildren will have better land than we have now, because our grandparents have better land than we have now. And we've degraded it over the last 100 years in many regards. We've been able to maintain yields because we supplement with agrochemicals. But we've got nitrogen problems in drinking water. We've got phosphorus problems in the Great Lakes. There's a great dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi. We've got health problems, cancer hotspots in farming communities. We've got residues of pesticides showing up in our foods and grocery stores. And herbicides. Farming is ripe for a re-envisioning and a retooling in ways that will actually help build the fertility of the land and produce cleaner, healthier food off of the landscape. And I think these style of regenerative agriculture that can take conventional farms and turn them into organic-ish farms, these farms that use far less in the way of chemicals, that's where the opportunity for huge change lies in agriculture. There's an awful lot of farmers in North America that won't become organic farmers overnight. But I think that we could, over the next 20 or 30 years or so, convert conventional agriculture into an organic-ish style because it works for the farmers. In order for farming practices to be sustainable, they have to be profitable for the farmers or they won't be sustained. And that's one of the things that's turned me into an optimist on this issue, is the practices that can help us rebuild healthy, fertile soils can also help us with farm profitability, help us reduce their off-site environmental impacts, help us reduce the health impacts of modern agriculture. I have yet to find the reason we shouldn't go this route. And I'm very enthused and fairly optimistic about it, because if we can pull off that transition in the next 20 or 30 years, that's fast. That's one of the advantages of being a geologist is, you can be frustrated year to year, but if you have 5% change a year, over 20 years, it's the whole game.
If the level of carbon and organic matter in soils were increased to what they once were, how would this influence the amount of synthetic fertilizer and other agricultural chemicals that farmers use?
There was a little-known study that came out back, I think it was 1978, where they looked at the isotopic composition of carbon in the atmosphere, and they were able to actually figure out that roughly a third of the carbon that had been added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution didn't come out of a smokestack or a tailpipe. It came from plowing up new farmland, from degrading the organic matter in the soil. And there's every reason to believe we could put an awful lot of carbon back into the world's farmland soils if we changed our agricultural practices to these more conservation agricultural oriented practices, because the microbial life will build up that carbon over time if we change our farming practices so that we're not shooting it off the other direction. And if we did that, we could not only sequester a fair amount of carbon in the soil, but it would reduce our reliance on nitrogen fertilizers, which would reduce our production of other greenhouse gases, and it would also reduce our use of diesel in farming because we wouldn't be plowing as much and driving tractors as much. Agriculture is one of these areas where if we reimagine it, if we rethink how it's done, we could have a big impact on the climate in terms of how much carbon people estimate we could put in the world's farmland soils. Frankly, the estimates are all over the map. But even the low end of the estimates are a good down payment on addressing the climate problem. The high end of the estimates, I mean, my personal opinion is they're probably oversold. I view this new style of regenerative agriculture that can build soil organic matter, that can put carbon back in the ground, as a key element in a planetary carbon management plan. But it's not a permanent solution. You can only put so much carbon in the soil. But it could help us. It could be a real wedge in terms of dealing with the climate issue over the next century. And the side benefit, healthier, more fertile land that can grow more food and feed more people better food, I mean, that's worth doing just for that right there.
Can restoring soil help slow down or reverse climate change and other environmental problems?
Yeah, if we look at the side benefits that we could get from restoring health to the world's farmland soils by putting more carbon in the ground, building the organic matter content up, we could not only pull carbon from the atmosphere, which would help with the climate problem, but it would also help us reduce off-site environmental impacts, reduce the nitrogen going into our water supplies and wells around cities. It could help, it would help us conserve biodiversity, because if we're using less pesticide on farms, we'll have more organisms on farms. And not all organisms are bad. One of the problems with broad-spectrum pesticides on farmland is that if we take a broad-spectrum pesticide, because there's some, like a corn pest, for example, and you apply it to a field, you kill all the things that eat that pest too. You're taking out all the predators. And what we generally see is that the pests come back first. It's kind of like weeds. You know, your favorite plant doesn't come back in the garden first. And pests are kind of the same way. So there's these other side benefits that would really flow from restoring healthy, fertile soils that are just not restricted to on the farm. And if we look at the global biodiversity problem, something like 25% of the world's continental landmass is devoted to agriculture. A big part of what life is going to share this planet with us in the future is going to be the life on farms and on rangeland. And if we treat the land in ways that promote beneficial life that we like sharing the landscape with, while suppressing the pests and pathogens, we'll have a nicer world.
Could you sum up your book in 10 words or less?
Sure. Ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. That's the recipe for growing healthy, fertile soils. You could add livestock back into the mix if you want, and if the livestock's managed right in ways that could actually help build soil organic matter, but ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity, in my view, is the real game changer.
Please tell me, what is a quick summary of your book, The Hidden Half of Nature?
The Hidden Half of Nature is really about this emerging, burgeoning area in science that is telling us how important the microbial world is for not only our well-being and health, but also that of our crops that we eat. In fact, every plant on this planet and basically every living organism. We people often think we're very special, we're different than other life forms, but what we're learning from microbiome research is that there are other life forms that are actually a part of our body, and it's microorganisms. And so some people are, well, what's a microorganism? It's pretty simple. They're single-celled organisms, and because they're single-celled, they are too small for us to see with the naked eye. So they've sort of been out of our mind because we can't see them, but they form a really important part of our body. And I came to this realization with my co-author and husband, David Montgomery, when we wrote The Hidden Half of Nature. And in The Hidden Half of Nature, we weave in some history, some personal memoir and experience, and also a good deal of the science itself to tell the story of microbiomes and why we all need to really understand them a lot better than we do, and have people sort of appreciate this part of nature, which in fact is a part of our bodies.
How does soil health affect the health of our gut and microbiome?
That is a good question, and it's not completely understood. But there's some dots that researchers are starting to connect, and it's also an area that I'm interested in writing more about and researching myself. Because the basic idea is this, and this was first sort of hypothesized in the early part of the 20th century by some British farmers. People who do organic farming probably know the name Sir Albert Howard. And he had a peer around this time, this would have been in the 1930s, 1940s, Lady Eve Balfour. And what they had noticed in England and Howard in India, where he was doing a lot of work, is that when crops were sick, that translated into sick animals, pigs and cows, chickens and so on, and that rippled out to people. And so this chain of poor health would ripple from the soil where we're growing our crops all the way to the people who are eating it. And so what we're learning now, partly through microbiome research, is that a plant's green body is really quite miraculous, and especially the root system. And when you have a fully functioning soil microbiome, and that area around the roots we call the root microbiome, when that's fully functioning, which is to say dense and abundant with beneficial microorganisms, when that is in play, you get robust, healthy plants or crops, and that means nutrient density. That means they're able to incorporate many of the elements and nutrients in soil into their green bodies. Animals or people that eat those nutrient-dense plants are therefore getting all of the minerals and elements that we need for our health. And so that's the connection. And we know some dots, but we're still trying to connect that all up. And as it is connecting up, it is also telling us a lot about agricultural practices, about diets, about how we're all sort of linked at the hip, if you will, from the soil to the way our biochemistry and metabolism and many, many cellular activities are working in our bodies.
What is a microbiome?
That is a good question. What is a microbiome? It refers to really the communities of microbes. So that could be bacteria, even virus, fungi, and maybe some other organisms that are part of a community, and they inhabit what's called a host. People are hosts, plants are hosts, fish, cats, dogs, every living thing has its own microbiome, and microbiomes are unique. Mine is as different from yours as it is to people who are watching this. No two are alike. And the whole thing about microbiomes, which is a little bit counterintuitive for some people if they haven't either been heard of this before, is that we once thought we shouldn't have microbes around us. These are pathogens, they cause disease, but what we're learning is that, in fact, it's the presence of microorganisms and not their absence which keeps us healthy and well, at least helps to. And a microbiome, therefore, on the whole, is more beneficial to us or plants than it is harmful. And that gets into questions of then, I think we need to be talking about microbiomes a lot more than we do, because many people don't exactly understand what one is, and they really don't necessarily understand how is it then that we can sort of take care of our microbiome. And I think about the care aspect as sort of, three basic things. You want to first of all protect your microbiome, because if you're protecting it, you're not losing it. Because when you lose it or a portion of it or something takes a hit, then you're looking at some sort of restorative activity, which we all know nothing is ever quite as good if you have to rebuild it as it is when you first get it. So protection, restoration, and then whether you have your own microbiome that's never taken a hit, which is probably pretty unlikely, or you have a some portion that's been restored, you want to cultivate it. Because these are living organisms, living communities that are really sitting in an ecosystem that is our gut. So it's protect, restore, and cultivate that microbiome.
How do we keep in close contact with the microbes that benefit our health while protecting ourselves from those that cause ill health and disease?
Yes. And ever since writing The Hidden Half of Nature and giving this topic a lot of thought, what I have learned is there's one thing about the microbial world, and it's this. It is filled with duality. It is the classic double-edged sword. Because, like the question implied, we need these microbes that are a part of our microbiome, but there's some hitchhikers sometimes in these microbial communities, and these are the pathogens. These are the disease-causing organisms. So, say from the bacterium that causes TB to a virus in more modern times that causes HIV. So, what we want to be thinking about is let's minimize our exposure to the bad actors and let's maximize our exposure to the good actors of the microbiome. And so what that means is we're going to want to be making sure that through our diet, through visits to the doctor, that if there's things that look like they might be impacting the microbiome negatively, that we think about a behavior before we do something. So when it comes to these beneficial microorganisms that make up our microbiome, they are very, very sensitive to the introduction of other things to their community, and that includes pathogens. And so if a pathogen comes into the gut, let's say, those microbiota that are a part of our microbiome, they can send signals to the cells that line our gut to say, hey, human being, you need to amp up the production of antimicrobial compounds because we just noticed the arrival of such and such a pathogen. And so there's this communication between our immune system and our beneficial microorganisms, where as long as our immune system sort of knows friend from foe and it's getting all the communication and information that it needs from our microbiome, we can take care of pathogens that way. And by take care, I mean kill them off, get them out of the body. So this is why you really want to be nurturing and taking care of your microbiome, because they work in concert with our immune system to deal with these bad actors. And the other thing, I had mentioned this duality, this double-edged sword aspect of the microbiome. And this is what's very, it can be problematic. It's very interesting if you're a researcher, and that is that some of these beneficial microbes are only beneficial in certain circumstances. They can turn and they can become pathogenic. And that can happen through a change in a person's diet, perhaps. It can certainly happen with the introduction of antibiotics, which can wreak havoc on the microbiome, because antibiotics are a good thing to have if you've got a serious infection. But if you don't, and you're taking them either on purpose or you're getting them inadvertently through something in your diet, it scrambles and it perturbs the microbiome. And it's when you get those kind of, I would call it sort of a confusion, bacterial members will all of a sudden not quite stay in their beneficial role, and they can start doing other things which are problematic. And so that's why if you let these communities be who they are, communicate how they communicate with themselves and with their host organism, that's really the best recipe for using and letting our microbiome, work just like it's supposed to.
There are people who say that the best thing for our gut is fermented food. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, fermented food. I don't know about the best thing. It's certainly a beneficial thing, and it's not a harmful thing at all. Fermented foods are really quite interesting because they're plant foods, right, that have been broken down. That's what all the fermentation has done. So they've been partly digested outside of the body. And what we know about the digestion of plant foods that occurs within our body, especially in the colon, is that the microbiota in our microbiome will consume what we eat, and then they will produce metabolites. And some of these metabolites are positive and some are negative. The ones that are positive, though, are those that are sort of fermentation byproducts. So when I think about fermented foods, I think it would be really interesting for somebody to do an analysis to tell us what are the microbial metabolites that are, say, in some of these krauts. And people are fermenting all kinds of things these days. Cabbage, of course, is the classic, but you can do beets, and you can do carrots, and you can do other kinds of root crops or even leafy things. So I think that what we have in these fermented foods, and part of what their benefit comes from, is, first of all, the foods themselves, they're not all the way digested. So in they come into our body, make it down to the colon, and the microbiota continue to consume those. But what we're also bringing into our bodies with these fermented foods are some of these medicinal compounds. And some people swear by these compounds. I think that we don't have a complete understanding of what all these compounds are and what they are doing. And you sort of also have to ask yourself, because fermentation is such an ancient, it's an ancient practice, and fermented foods are such an ancient part of the human diet. If they were bad for us, we would have figured this out thousands of years ago, and we wouldn't still be consuming many of these things, whether it's, fermented dairy, fermented fish, fermented vegetables, you name it, every culture's got something that they're fermenting. And I kind of think that's also how microbes kind of latched on to us, because as soon as we got these foods going, you had these cultures of microbes. And so we humans a long time ago began this symbiosis outside of our bodies through preparing and eating fermented foods. And the other thing that fermented foods do, which is pretty interesting, is they bring microorganisms into our body. And you'd probably have to sit here and eat kraut 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to get really significant populations into us. But we are bringing some microorganisms into our body, and those may be sticking around for a while and sort of repopulating our gut. So that's another advantage. So I think, and of course, many fermented foods have wonderful flavors and can add, zip and punch and everything to food. So I think there's definitely a lot of benefits to them.
You say that most of a person's microbiome resides in the digestive tract. Which part, and why is this significant?
Yeah. So let's talk about the digestive tract for a minute, because a lot of people sort of, unless you're a gastroenterologist or something like that, a lot of people just sort of think, oh, it's kind of the same from top to bottom and it does this and that. But there's really different things going on in the different places of our digestive tract. So let's start up at the top here. In comes the food, descends down into the stomach, this kind of, sac bowl-shaped thing. That's where a lot of the initial breakdown of our foods occur. It's very acidic in the stomach, and you'll oftentimes see these images, graphics of all of these bacteria in the stomach, and that's actually incorrect. It's quite acidic, and there are not a lot of bacteria in the stomach, and the reason for that is that our bodies have figured out that if there are any pathogens in the food, you want to zap them right away. Into the stomach they come. That acidic environment kills off a lot of things, including these pathogens. The partly digested food then descends down into the small intestine. So whenever you see those figures of a digestive tract, there's like sausage kind of looking loops, that's the small intestine. Food passes into that part, and it just continues digestion, the breakdown process. And it's a lot of length in our small intestine. So things are moving along, and get to the lower reaches. And by that time, most of the food that we've eaten is broken down to the point where these nutrients are exiting out of the intestine into our blood, being taken off to wherever they're needed in our body. So that is the case with simple carbohydrates like sugars. These are small molecules, easy to break down. That's the case with proteins, whether meat protein or plant protein, and that's also the case with fats. But there's one kind of food that we do not have the genes that make these enzymes to break down this sort of fourth category of food, and that is fiber, also known as complex carbohydrates or whole plant foods. And what we know about the microbiome and how this relates to the digestive tract is that most of our microbiome, of our whole body, of everywhere, is not in the stomach or not on the outside of our bodies. It's in the colon, the lion's share of our microbiome. So all of these foods that land in the colon poorly digested, you really need to think of your colon as sort of like tranquil grazing pastures for all of these microbiota, because they're consuming and breaking down these whole plant foods. And that's why it's really important that we distinguish between these different parts of the digestive tract, because what also happens in the colon is that once these plant foods are broken down, a bacterium is just like any other life form. It excretes waste products, only we need a whole new word for this term waste product, because these compounds have a medicinal value in our bodies. One compound that's fairly well known is called butyrate. And so the feedstock, meaning plant foods come into the human body, they're digested in the colon by the microbiome. Butyrate is one of these waste products. Another word, if you ever hear it, is microbial metabolite, okay? That's just exiting the microbe's body. And butyrate, it turns out, is an energy source. It's sort of like an all-around tonic, as well as an energy source for our cells that line our colon. So the colon's a hard-working place. It never shuts down. You have cells constantly regenerating, doing their thing. And so what you want is you want a really nice energy source for those cells. So you don't want any abnormal cell growth. You don't want any irregularities, because that's sort of that's setting the stage for cancer and other problems. So as long as you have your microbes that are getting the food that they can produce butyrate and a bunch of other compounds from, then that keeps our body, it keeps our colon in good shape. And it's actually thought that up to 40%, say the molecules and compounds circulating in my body, your body, people who are watching this, they were not made by our human cells. They were made by a microbial cell. And so some people think, oh, I'm creeped out. Some people think, like I'm a biologist, I think, wow, that's kind of cool. That's pretty interesting. What are these compounds and what are they doing? So butyrate is one. Another one that's made in the gut is a neurotransmitter that travels out of our gut and up to our brain. It's the neurotransmitter serotonin. And this affects, are we happy? Are we sad? What is our mood? So there's still much about the microbiome that we need to learn in terms of the metabolites that are being made in the colon and other places, and how they exit the digestive tract and how they're influencing and impacting the rest of our bodies.
Why is a diet abundant in plant foods so important?
Yeah, I like to talk about diet in terms of sort of the major things that we humans eat. We're pretty unique as a species because from our teeth to the length of our gut and the type of gut that we have, we're really sort of built for omnivory. So that is eating a wide variety of things. But what we're learning about the microbiome is that what is best for us is when our microbiome is mostly consuming plant foods. So I think we need to take this saying that we've all heard, this phrase, you are what you eat. We really are what our microbiomes are eating. And our microbiomes can eat anything down in our colon. Plant foods, animal foods, what have you. But because of the metabolites that our microbiome makes in our colon, we get very beneficial metabolites coming off of plant foods. Because when the fiber of plant foods and the phytochemicals that are embedded in that fiber, when that's fermented in our gut, these compounds that our microbiome is making are then what our body needs. With meat, it's looking like what happens is especially on a meat-heavy diet, someone who is just occasionally eating meat, this likely is not a problem, but the typical Western diet, which contains a lot of meat, undigested protein, because it's sort of overwhelmed our small intestine with digestion processes, it descends down into the colon incompletely digested. It's protein, and a protein is very different than a complex carbohydrate to a bacterium. And when meat proteins are digested, different kinds of metabolites come out of our microbiome than when they're digesting plant foods. And what it's looking like is that the metabolites that come off of meats are harmful in some way or toxic to cells lining our colon. So that is likely, there's research and evidence that points to colon cancer and the connection to meat being not so much the meat as what the microbiome is producing when it is consuming meat. It just, bacteria are just kicking waste products off after they consume what is in our diet. So they don't have any intention to be, good or bad or harmful or beneficial. They're just getting energy based on what our diet is. And so if we are not careful, we are sort of turning our onboard medicine chest into sort of an onboard problem chest. And our bodies are really resilient, and we have many processes that can sort of push back on these toxins in our body. But as soon as you overwhelm any system with too much of a toxic environment, it just becomes very hard for our bodies to get, sort of back where they need to be. But that is the basic, that in a nutshell is why it's really important to think about these different parts of our digestive tract and what our microbiome is producing, in our colon, beneficial things or harmful things.
We've all heard phrases like, go with your gut, and had the experience of feeling relaxed and happy after a nice meal. Is there any connection to the microbiome?
Yes, I think so. When any organism is well fed, it's going to function properly and it's going to function normally. So if we're eating, 3 meals a day, not really big meals, our microbiome is getting, a steady stream of nutrients, abundant in plant foods. That means our microbiome is producing these compounds that are then leaving our gut and interacting with other systems in our body, whether that be our brain, our central nervous system. I'd mentioned before the neurotransmitter serotonin. When that's at ample, steady supply, our brain is functioning normally. We're in a good mood. So you want your microbiome to be well fed and satiated, if you will, because when it is, it activates and is interacting with other parts of our body that then can function normally. And we all know that when something is amiss, we're either hungry or we're sick or we're dealing with some kind of stress, our gut is also upset. And so there's a reason people also call our gut kind of our second brain, because we just think about it in terms of food and diet, but because of all of the communication and the signaling between our gut microbiota and our immune system, our nervous system, our circulatory system, and so on, we know that when you're eating a diet that is nourishing and consistent for the microbiome, things are just going to be, humming and thrumming along just like they should. And so there is evidence, I think, for all of this. And some evolutionary biologists even think, well, maybe it goes back, way back, that these hitchhiker microbes found their way from nature out there. We picked them up from the soil, from the ground we walked on, from the water we once drank out of rivers and streams. And if you think about it, little tiny bacterium, our body is a pretty safe place compared to the nature that is outside of our bodies. Inside our bodies, some of these microbes have figured out ways to form symbiotic relationships with our cells, with our biochemistry, with our metabolism. And so it kind of stands to reason, they're happy and well fed, they're going to keep doing the things that hold up their side of the partnership. And for that, they rely on us to hold up our side of the partnership, which is, a diet abundant in plant foods.
Is that well-known saying, "you are what you eat," accurate? If not, how would you change it?
Yeah, I think at a gut level, everybody realizes, yeah, I know my diet affects my health. I know at some level I am what I eat. And what this new area of science is telling us is that it's a little more complicated than that. It's telling us that our brain is selecting food, but it's also telling us that what happens to that food is bringing another player into this sort of environment, into this notion of you are what you eat. And that other player, of course, is our microbiome. Our microbiome cannot get up, leave our bodies, go off to a restaurant, and come back in. It's stuck. For better or worse, our microbiome is stuck with us, and we are stuck with our microbiome. And because of all of the microbial metabolites that they produce that I talked about before, we really are what our microbiome eats. And this, we can sometimes tussle with our microbiome and with ourselves because our brain loves sugar. And so we find ourselves in a grocery store, at a restaurant, and the brain is scanning the dessert menu. If the microbiome were there by our side on the table, it would say, be scanning the vegetables too. So we sometimes get in this our brain pushes us one way, and our gut, if we could listen to it, would be pushing us another way. And so we all do this. And so the way I sort of deal with that, I'm like, okay, what is, yeah, I know brain, I know you'd like to have this or that. But then I stop and I ask myself, have I fed my microbiome today? And if I haven't, I say, okay, brain, hold off. We're going to feed the microbiome, and then you can have what you'd like. Not a bunch of it, not every day, but kind of everything in moderation, because I'm really more interested in supporting my microbiome than I am in sort of succumbing to the big power of the brain.
In your book, The Hidden Half of Nature, you draw some important parallels between the human gut and the root system of a plant. What are they, and why are they significant?
What's interesting when it comes to the root and when it comes to the gut is that we now know that the lion's share of our respective microbiomes, so the human microbiome and the plant microbiome. In the botanical world, most of the microbiome is on or inside of the root system of a plant. And when it comes to us, of course, our microbiome, most of it is in our digestive tract, and as I've discussed before, most of it is in the colon. So right away, you get those two facts and you line them up and you're like, why would that be? And it has to do with nutrients. It has to do with these microorganisms, which are these, you can think of them as micro-ecosystems. And one of those ecosystems is in the gut, and one of those ecosystems is in and around the roots of a plant. So there's all of this nutrient processing and exchange going on between the plant and its root microbiome and us and our gut microbiome. And the kinds of things that happen, for example, in the botanical world is the root microbiome consumes exudates. Exudates are things that the plant's green body manufactures. And like that word sort of sounds, they exude out of the roots. They ooze, they flow out of the roots into this like nano micro space right at the surface of a root. And these microorganisms are consuming these exudates. It sounds a lot like our meals. It consists of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And those kind of foods are unique if you're a bacterium living in the soil, and they are only to be found in these plant exudates. And what the plant is getting when it feeds these exudates to the microorganisms is it's getting in return things like plant growth promoting hormones. Not made in the plant's body, made in the soil by the root microbiome. So a plant needs these hormones for normal growth and development. So, and in our body, there's many metabolites that our microbes are producing in our gut. I've talked about a couple of them. Butyrate is really important in the colon, serotonin really important for our central nervous system. So what you have are these sort of twin systems. It's these exchanges of goods. They're sort of like, think of it like biological bazaars. Bazaars are zones of intense trading for goods. I give you this thing, you give me that thing. And that's what's going on in the root and the gut. And so when everything is working properly, high functioning, you get a really healthy plant, and you also get a really healthy person. And so you string all of this together. The nutrients, the microbial metabolites that come off of these nutrients, the fact that plants and people use these metabolites as a part of our immune and defensive strategy. You add those three things up, and it really comes to a form of nature's intelligence or biological intelligence, right? Because what more are we than, we need to eat, we need to stay alive, and we need to procreate. And that's what the microbiome helps us and helps plants do. And it makes sense at some level if you think about the trajectory of human evolution and how long we have been around, several 100,000 years, a couple 100,000 years. And way back then, we didn't have any pharmaceutical companies. We didn't have any agrochemical companies. We didn't, of course, have any stores. Commerce wasn't really a thing. And so what we had was nature. What we had was our microbiome. And that is what has, kept us going all of this time that we have been on this earth. And it's only been fairly recently, let's say maybe the last 200 years or so, that modernity has brought many other things into our bodies, into our lives. Much of it is good, but some of it is maybe not quite so good for our microbiome. So what we want to think about is how do we support these systems? Because really, whether you're a plant or you're a person, your microbiome, so long as you feed it the right things, is this onboard medicine chest and defense system, and it's just sort of all around well-being.
Could you sum up the main message of the hidden half of nature in 10 words or less?
I can, because I've thought about this a lot. This interview has been a lot of information. Our talks contain a lot of information about all this. And so if you're watching this now and later you decide, I've got to tell somebody about this, but where do I start? I've boiled it down to 6 words, and here they are. Mulch your soil inside and out. Thank you.